Welcome to my next episode of 21 and 21. I have a good friend, and what do they say in the business? I'm podcasting the podcaster. Kashef Qaadri is I've met Kashef about, 8, 9, 10 years ago. A couple of conferences, we run into each other all the time. Kashef, maybe a quick intro on what you do at Bio-Rad, and we'll kind of jump into some interesting parts of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sanjay. I don't remember the exact timing of when we first met, but yeah, it's been a while, and it's always nice bumping into you. So as you mentioned, my name is Kashef. I work for Bio-Rad Laboratories, which is based in Hercules, California, currently in global marketing, leading software strategy within our life sciences group.
Thank you. And we just chatted about the cloud. And speaking about the cloud, tell me, so I supported your political campaign. And I told you you're an extremely brave guy, and I told you that many times recently in Boston when I met you. So maybe your perspective on starting off before we get into education and why I got into politics. What has the run for political office taught you from a business perspective?
Yeah, I see a lot of commonalities between kind of what I do professionally and what I was doing with the campaign. But in a very different context, right? So there were a few lessons that I kind of learned from that. First is just around social media and the importance of social media, being able to connect with people, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or something else. And that was, I would say, exacerbated in the context of COVID, like running for political office. As you know, I was running for city council for the city of Dublin in California. And so it was difficult in California to try to connect with people face to face. So social media was a big one there. I would say the second lesson is just around a lot of what I learned working for a number of startup companies with like the bootstrap mentality. It's really easy to get carried away with the campaigns, spending a lot of money to do professional videos, for instance. I literally have a 9-year-old MacBook Air, and I was doing video editing, putting on the little watermark, and doing really basic content creation. My son's into video, into movies and like making movies. So we have a green screen and like lights and stuff like that, but just really low budget, like bootstrap type attitude. And I'm sure you can kind of appreciate that given your background. And then the other two things are just like partnering, right? In the form of a technology company, you want to partner with bigger players in the space. In the context of like the political campaign, you want to partner in the form of like endorsements and get aligned with other candidates that you kind of see eye to eye with. And then the final thing is just around VOC, right? Like in the technical world or professional world, we call it VOC. And then campaigning, it's doing like market research or just, understanding where your audience stands on different topics and being able to speak to that. And one thing that I learned really quickly on is that I could come out and say things that I truly believed in and sort of force the issue. Other candidates would have to respond to that. All in all, it was a great time, lots of fun. And I say all of this with the big caveat in that I did not win. So all of that could just be, completely, bad advice or a bad experience.
Hey, what do they say in startups, right? Actually, understanding what not winning teaches you a lot more lessons than, winning easily, I guess.
Right,
but thank you for that history, a little bit of history, but let's go back a little bit more. My mother used to tell me the word idiot comes from the word idiotus, where you don't participate in public discourse. So what made you think about politics? What was in your growing up or in education that got you interested in this stuff?
Yeah, kind of early on, elementary school, middle school, kind of leading into high school and even college, I was involved in student government organizations at this class level, school level, progressively got involved on the in the county and even the state level of student councils. And I've just got a sort of passion for trying to help the community and felt this was my way of kind of giving back to the community, right? just have a passion to serve, and I felt like that was a good opportunity. Apparently about 4,000 people also, were agreed, but yeah, as I mentioned, I did not win, but yeah, we'll see what the future holds.
Yeah, exciting. So I used to use Bio-Rad products. I used to be a bench science guy for many years, and I just was going through the catalog, and there were this, it was PCR has become famous again thanks to the pandemic, and I spent a few years in flow cytometry, and with more interesting methods and scientific understanding of what's going on in immunology, what's going on with biology, you see a lot more data coming in, not just from standard PCR, but genome sequencing, all of which, and imaging, all of which Bio-Rad handles. What is your opinion? You've talked to a lot of the thought leaders in your podcasts and even in your day-to-day. Where do you see this world of data going?
Yeah, definitely see as everything is becoming a lot more high throughput, right? There's the data deluge issue. How do you deal with ever expanding data sets? I was just recently chatting with a colleague of mine. I have done bulk RNA sequencing, right, and quite a bit, and you're talking about single digit gigabytes. Yeah, so we're definitely dealing with a lot more high throughput, a lot more screening, rapid expansion of data sets, right? So bulk single digit gigabytes to single cell world, right? We're 150 gigabyte plus data files, right? And that's not just in the context of NGS sequencing. That's happening in imaging, deeper, like more higher resolution, deeper depth, right? And across the board, lots of data. I think a lot of people are having a problem keeping up with like the data management aspect of it. But more importantly, they're having issues with how do I try to make sense of all of my data, right? The interpretation is still a huge bottleneck.
Yeah, and the cost of interpretation as well. All of this stuff has cost attached to it.
Yeah, as a bioinformatics person, right?
Absolutely.
Like a background in bioinformatics at the
yeah, you don't worry about that. Yeah, they say, oh, hey, I bought this instrument for $100K, but the consumables cost me $1 million. No, I'm kidding. But and more judicious use of both data and the instrumentation. I was involved in some of the biology in the early days of COVID-19. There were quite a few issues that, of course, humans not understanding rapid logarithmic growth of both the spread and the data and the transfer and all this stuff. Some of the issues that were specific to instrumentation were things like, is my cycle time for my PCR going to be 40, which is extremely sensitive? Or do I dial it down to 20, which is not that sensitive, but then you don't catch enough? Those were some of the early issues. Some of those things, until the FDA resolved it more recently, were going on for a year. And then there's this whole issue of data transfer. I remember in the early days, it's called the PUI form, the person under interest, where you had to not only share it with your city and local governments, but state and federal government, the CDC as well. And every one of them had a different method of doing this.
Right.
Bio-Rad's done really well because you handle a lot of the PCR and the consumables and some of these other things that are critical to our economic engine taking off again. What were some of the internal things that you faced within Bio-Rad as this pandemic was unfolding?
Yeah, so I certainly can't speak to the company itself, but just personally how I was impacted, right? A lot of basic research slowed down, right? People weren't going into the lab. A lot of those efforts very quickly shifted to the PCR world and identifying, COVID and being able to diagnose it. There were obviously issues around supply chain, right? And that's not unique to Bio-Rad, and that's certainly not unique to life sciences or diagnostics, right? I mean, there's a huge car chip shortage, right? And that's expected to last for the next year. There's all sorts of bottlenecks. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday where Biden was talking about opening up the LA ports and trying to make them 24/7, right? So there fundamental supply chain issues that are going on. Within the context of PCR, right? You talked about issues with data transfer and cycle times and false positives. Me personally, right? It's all, people were rushed into the context of COVID and trying to respond, right? And I think personally, I would rather have more false positives than false negatives. I'd rather lock people down and quarantine them. And yes, it's an inconvenience and sure, there are ramifications to that, but it generally puts people in a safer spot than if you have them out, kind of spreading. And I think I was just reading a report yesterday on TB and how the number of TB cases are actually underreported, which is
the first thing was you mentioned TB. And I could tell you the number of latent TB cases that have actually now become full-blown TB in several countries. It is not more than anecdotal. It's actually a problem. One of the women I grew up with as a little kid, she's one of the experts in TB in India, and she was saying there's a lot of neglected stuff that happened, but there's also another angle to this, both the mycobacterium, which the TB is. There may be a link to the virus too, and there may be a link between diabetes and tuberculosis as well, latent TB. And so these are all things that we need to pay closer attention to, public health and preventive care, where this, how do I put this nicely, curly-haired, red-headed bastard stepchild for the last 20 years. And it has suddenly become important. And, again, you're involved in an organization that actually builds some of those front-end testing devices, both on the blood chemistry side as well as PCR. And so we are kind of heading into this new era. You mentioned, I actually teach a class on the business of technology at the University of Washington. I was talking to the students about the fact that even the goods within the United States, the most transported, the engine used most is trucking. Trucking and rail transport the most goods in the US. And I was talking to them about some weird indexes like the Baltic Dry Good Index, which transports raw material around the world in ships. And the freight rates have doubled. And you talk about LA ports, and not just ports docking into China. China has increased the rates, but the ships coming back as well. So we're kind of entering this new world of where we thought, hey, just-in-time manufacturing was a good thing, and exporting something that was very low cost from somewhere else was a good thing. And I think we're rewriting some of that history, not only rewriting the history of biology. So let me kind of riff on that.
Some major,
yeah, please.
No, I was just going to say some major paradigm shifts.
Yeah. So riffing on that, on the population health and the preventive care and precision medicine, as you are kind of involved in this world of cloud architectures and application layers, what is your take on some of these issues where data will sit in maybe 2 or 3 years? Yeah,
so that ties back to your earlier question, specifically around the PCR with data transfer, right? And so typically the setup is either you have a connected laptop to your PCR instrument where you design your experiment, plate protocol design, you talked about the cycles and the temperatures and all of that, right? And either you have a dedicated laptop that's controlling the instrument, or you do it kind of remotely and walk over with a thumb drive, right? And on the retrieval side, it's the same way, where you either have that connected instrument and you do the data analysis then and there, or you save it onto a thumb drive and then go over to your office and do the analysis. And for the past 3 years or so, I've been helping lead the strategy and team around what we call now BR.io. It's a Bio-Rad product, which is answering that, or trying to address that gap of like your connected instrument, right? So now you can design your plate protocol from anywhere using a web browser. That instrument is connected to the cloud, so you can just pull that plate protocol, hit go. You can monitor the status, and then once your data are generated, it goes back to the cloud and you can do analysis. So that eliminates a lot of steps. That makes the data transfer a lot easier. Looking forward, we realize that we're one player in a much larger ecosystem when it comes to biopharma or diagnostic labs, in the life sciences space. And we're looking at ways of how we can make more interconnections, right? Like, so we're not trying to we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're not trying to recreate an entire IT landscape. It's what's the role that Bio-Rad plays and how do we connect into an already existing architecture infrastructure.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And I've been talking to, so 40 to 60% of my discussions are this, I'll quote you, connected instrument. And many years ago, a very interesting guy named Jim Gray, he was a mathematician, he used to work at Microsoft Research. He coined the term the worldwide telescope. And I will kind of riff on your statement and his thesis and say, we will have a worldwide instrument. And the worldwide instrument is, whatever the physician wants, and you'll have a smorgasbord of methods available and instruments available, and analytics platforms available, and results as well at some point. I kind of work in the cybersecurity business nowadays. As we kind of move into this hybrid architecture of the cloud serving quite a bit of that analysis and the storage and some other things, whereas the instruments you can't put in the cloud because it has to be closest to where the action is happening. Any thoughts on where the organization is looking at this space, especially in supply chain and other areas which are somewhat more complex too?
Yeah, I can't really address what the company is thinking, right? But personally, we moved from on-prem servers and infrastructure to putting those on the cloud, right? And that opens up a lot of opportunities in terms of scalability and performance and security, and kind of the idea of blockchain and being able to have distributed services, et cetera. I personally view this as moving, like the life sciences, particularly diagnostics, moving in that direction, where we already have contract research organizations or sequencing cores, for instance, where you ship them a sample, they'll load it onto a sequencer, and then you get back a FASTQ file, right? Or BCL if you're really interested in getting more raw data. But I definitely see this being a trend, or at least a direction that the market will move in, where you don't necessarily need to have that big box sitting in your lab collocated with everything else. You could do some stage of your sample prep, ship your sample off, and it could be anywhere, right? Like maybe it's cheaper to do this in Alaska, maybe it's cheaper in New York, maybe it's cheaper in somewhere in Europe, right? But you have like a service center that will load your sample, do the experimentation, and then send you back the data, and perhaps not even send back the data, but the data are being streamed back to you, right? And so lowers the cost of entry, right? Like the barriers of entry. You move away from CapEx, you start moving to more service as a model, right? And things just happen a lot more efficiently, and research organizations can focus on the data and the interpretation as opposed to even playing with a physical device, right?
This is a great point. And you bring up, again, I'll probably riff on what you just mentioned, and this whole issue of data as a service. I used to run an R&D business for a little while where you actually moved samples. And one thing I learned from that exercise was the customs department actually has more authority than the FBI when you're moving biological samples around, especially outside the United States, for obvious reasons. And bringing it back is even harder. I have to fill like 30 forms and whatnot. But just moving data around, it has some complications in the near future because the privacy rider for GDPR went away to the United States. So you probably have to have silos, and you probably have to have some sort of federated learning and federated security model. But all of that is possible. So in closing, let's go from your upbringing to politics to Bio-Rad to your, you did some RNA stuff in your day and you've done some science. So what is your final thoughts, closing thoughts on research, translation, and the world we're getting into?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because I started off in a wet lab and got kind of roped into bioinformatics. And I feel like that is just like a big metaphor for translational research where there's a lot, there's obviously a huge value in doing wet lab experiments. A lot of that is becoming more automated. And there's a lot of, design thinking around what actual wet lab experiments you're doing, and designing those experiments, right? And there's been this huge shift to the value of your data. and making your data more valuable and kind of leveraging data that already exists, right? And it's interesting seeing that shift happening where things are becoming more automated, more distributed, more automated, and the next evolution of this is going to be just smarter science, leveraging AI and ML to be more inform the science and the interpretation.
Thank you. You mentioned design thinking, and I have to put the 3 principles of design thinking out there. One is empathy. The other one is diversity. We talked about how genome sequencing has to be more diverse. And then finally, prototyping. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and make that part of the scientific method itself. Kashef, it was wonderful chatting with you. Not just running into each other in conferences and saying hello, but actually having a good dialogue. And thank you again for your time. And thank you for watching 21 and 21.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.